Good afternoon. You're listening to Eye on the Valley right here on CIVL 101.7 FM, broadcasting to the Fraser Valley, broadcasting from the University of the Fraser Valley's Abbotsford campus on the traditional and unceded territory of the Stolo people. This program is also live streamed throughout the world on CIVL's website. I am your host, Surjit Atwal. I have a CIVL exclusive for you today, an interview with Professor Jeffry Frieden, political science professor from Harvard University. Professor Frieden is an internationally known political scientist who has written multiple books and published multiple articles in international journals and newspapers. We will be discussing global economic policy. Thank you for joining us. I have a great privilege and a great pleasure to introduce Jeff Frieden from the University of Harvard joining us today. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
My pleasure to be here.
My very first question for you, as you know, COVID-19 has caused a lot of economic problems around the world, such as supply chain problems, inflation, gas prices, just to name a few. Governments around the world have chosen to spend a lot of money taking care of their people's financial needs. In the long term, do you see that as a sustainable economic policy?
I don't think that the level of spending that we're seeing today is sustainable because it was an emergency. So governments responded, I think, very appropriately by trying to cover at least some of the gap in output and income that the pandemic created. So in many instances, governments were running deficits and spending money to the tune of 6, 8, 10, 12% of GDP. That's an enormous set of expenditures, but it was justified by the great emergency that we, on almost every country in the world, found itself in. It is, I think, neither necessary nor a good idea to maintain that level of deficit spending indefinitely. If we were going to spend that amount of money for long periods of time, the debt burden on governments around the world would quickly become crushing, and either governments would have to default on their debts, which would be economically very difficult and would cause lots of financial problems, or they'd have to dramatically raise taxes, which also would not be such a good idea. So I think we have to recognize that the current level of spending was appropriate for the emergency, but is not something that can be sustained and maintained over the medium to long run.
In one of the papers you published, you talked about a term that you talked about was compensation hypothesis. Could you define that term for our listeners today?
Right. So almost every economic policy that we can think of, no matter how good they may be for the economy as a whole, is also going to create winners and losers. Economics is all about trade-offs. And anybody that tells you that an economic policy that they're promoting or they're thinking about is good for everyone and has no costs is either foolish or lying. So even the best economic policies are going to create, as I say, some winners and some losers. We can think, for example, of policies that increase productivity. Well, those policies, first of all, they may cost taxpayers money, and they may cause some jobs to become obsolete. Many jobs have become obsolete over time, either for technological reasons or because of international trade or changing tastes. And jobs that become obsolete really should disappear. We don't, try to keep the producers of buggy whips and horseless and horse-drawn carriages in business. We say, move into something different. So there are a whole range of policies that are good for society as a whole, but are not good for everyone. So the best way to deal with that is to compensate the people who are going to be harmed by these new policies with some of the benefits that these new policies or new procedures or new technologies are going to bring. The compensation hypothesis is often structured in terms of trade, but you could think about it in terms of technology as well. Imagine a new technology comes on stream that, for example, makes it unnecessary to have people work as, let's say, sanitation workers. We find ways of dramatically reducing the amount of human labor that goes into collecting garbage. Well, you've got a whole bunch of people who are going to lose their jobs as a result. Now, they might find other jobs, but it could take them 6-9 months to find another job. So we want to move away from this really sort of unpleasant labor of collecting garbage and have it done in a more automated way. But we also want to take care of the people who are going to be harmed by that technological change. And so we want to compensate them by either giving them money or retraining them or helping them find new jobs. So that's what the compensation hypothesis means. And what it really refers to is a socially desirable way of easing the transition from one kind of economic activity to another. Where it comes up most prominently is in trade, right? So trade has become very controversial over the last decade or two, but let's posit for the moment that buying a lot of cheaper goods from countries that make them more efficiently than we do is a good thing. That if we had to produce everything that we consume inside our borders, prices would be much higher. That consumers benefit by having access to clothing, footwear, furniture made in China or Thailand or Korea. Now, the fact is that opening our borders to furniture, footwear, and garments from East Asia or Latin America has put a lot of Americans out of work. There used to be big textile factories and garment factories. When I was growing up in New York, there were 500,000 people working in the garment industry. Now there's almost none. So what do you do about that? Well, it's a good thing that we can now have cheaper clothing, cheaper furniture, cheaper textiles, cheaper food even. But the cost of that is putting a lot of people out of work. So the compensation hypothesis says, let's use some of the benefits that we realized in getting these cheaper goods and use some of that by taxing the people who have benefited to help the workers who have been laid off, put out of work, made unemployed, helping them find new jobs, helping them move to new locations, helping them retool to become something else, a paralegal or someone in the healthcare industry, something that's needed by society now that with access to the goods from other countries, we don't need their labor in the garment or textile or furniture or toy industry.